Hello and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we consider a quiet sound from a mid-20th century kitchen. It is the gentle rhythmic hiss and jiggle of a small metal weight dancing atop the lid of a large steaming aluminum pot. To the modern ear, it is a sound of productivity, of summer's bounty being put away for winter. It speaks of jams and jellies, of crisp green beans and ripe tomatoes. But this unassuming sound represents the final chapter in a long, quiet, and often fraught technological journey. It is the sound of safety, of reliability, of a problem solved. For decades prior, the process of home canning was often a gamble, relying on a small, fallible dial and a simple valve that stood between a successful preservation and a kitchen disaster. To understand this journey from household hazard to trusted tool, we must go back to the years following the Great War and examine the overlooked evolution of the humble pressure canner gauge and its safety mechanisms. In the early 1920s, the practice of home canning was undergoing a significant transformation. The traditional method, known as the boiling water bath method, was well established for high-acid foods like fruits, pickles, and tomatoes. This process, which involved submerging sealed jars in boiling water for a prescribed period, was effective because the natural acidity of these foods inhibited the growth of dangerous microorganisms, most notably the spores of Clostridium botulinum. However, for low-acid foods, a category that included most vegetables, meats, and fish, boiling water simply wasn't hot enough. The spores of Clostridium botulinum could survive for hours at the 212 degrees Fahrenheit achieved in a standard boiling water bath at sea level. To safely preserve these foods, a much higher temperature was required, one that could only be achieved under pressure. This scientific reality gave rise to the pressure canner, a device that was, in essence, a specialized pressure cooker designed for processing jars. By sealing a pot and allowing steam to build up, the internal pressure would rise, and with it the temperature of the steam and water inside. A temperature of 240 degrees Fahrenheit, achievable at 10 pounds of pressure per square inch above atmospheric pressure, was found to be sufficient to destroy the resilient botulism spores in a reasonable amount of time. This was the promise of the pressure canner, the ability to safely preserve the entirety of a family's garden harvest, not just the acidic fruits. The early pressure canners of the 1920s were formidable pieces of equipment. They were typically constructed from heavy materials like cast aluminum or thick boilerplate steel. They were bulky, heavy, and often featured cumbersome clamping systems to secure the heavy lid to the pot. But the most critical components, the ones that dictated both the safety of the food and the safety of the user, were the pressure gauge and the safety relief valve. These two small devices were the brain and the failsafe of the entire operation, and in this early period, both were fraught with inconsistencies and potential points of failure. Let us first consider the pressure gauge. The vast majority of pressure canners in the 1920s were equipped with a dial gauge. This type of gauge, a familiar sight on all manner of pressurized equipment, typically relied on a mechanism known as a bourdon tube. The bourdon tube is a simple yet ingenious piece of mechanical engineering. It consists of a C-shaped or helical tube of a flexible metal, flattened into an elliptical cross-section and sealed at one end. The open end of the tube is connected to the pressure source, in this case, the inside of the canner. As pressure inside the tube increases, it attempts to straighten itself, much like a coiled party blower unfurls when you blow into it. This subtle movement of the sealed end of the tube is then translated, via a series of small levers and gears, to the rotation of a needle on a calibrated dial. The dial itself was the user's only window into the invisible world of pressure building within the pot. It was marked with numbers, typically from 0 to 20 or 30, representing pounds per square inch, or PSI. The home preserver would watch this needle climb as they heated the canner, adjusting the heat source to maintain the needle at the desired pressure, usually 10 or 15 psi, for the duration of the processing time specified in their recipe. The entire process hinged on the accuracy of this single instrument. Herein lay the first significant and pervasive problem. The bourdon tube gauges of the era were not always accurate, even when brand new. Manufacturing tolerances were not as precise as they are today, and a gauge might be off by 1, 2, or even 3 pounds right out of the box. A gauge that read 10 psi might actually be indicating a true pressure of only 8 psi. If a user processed their green beans at this indicated pressure, the internal temperature would not reach the required 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Instead, it would be closer to 235 degrees. While this seems like a small difference, it could be enough to allow botulism spores to survive, turning a jar of preserved food into a potential poison. Conversely, a gauge could read low. It might indicate 10 psi when the actual pressure inside was 12 or 13 psi. This would result in overprocessing the food, potentially harming its texture and nutritional content. But it also pushed the canner closer to its structural limits. While less of a food safety issue, it was a mechanical safety concern. The problem of inaccuracy was compounded by the fact that these gauges were delicate instruments operating in a harsh environment. The internal mechanism of levers and gears was susceptible to wear, vibration, and corrosion from the constant exposure to steam. If a canner lid was dropped, the gauge could be knocked out of calibration or damaged internally. The needle could stick, or the mechanism could become sluggish. A user might see the needle rise to 10 psi and hold steady, believing all was well, when in fact the needle was simply stuck while the pressure inside continued to climb. Furthermore, there was no widespread understanding among the general public that these gauges needed to be tested periodically. A pressure gauge was seen as a fixed, reliable instrument, much like a thermometer or a measuring cup. The idea that its accuracy could drift over time was not common knowledge. There was no established infrastructure for testing and recalibration. A homemaker in a rural area had little recourse if she suspected her gauge was faulty, other than to purchase a new one and hope it was more accurate. Alongside the gauge was the safety relief valve. If the gauge was the brain, the safety valve was the emergency release, the last line of defense against a catastrophic failure. The purpose of the safety valve was simple. If the pressure inside the canner exceeded a safe level, the valve should automatically open and vent the excess steam, preventing a dangerous buildup of pressure that could lead to an explosion. The designs of these early safety valves were varied and often rudimentary. One common type was a simple spring-loaded valve. A small plug or poppet was held against an opening or seat by the force of a compressed spring. The spring was chosen to exert a force that would be overcome by the pressure inside the canner at a certain set point, for instance, 20 psi. When the pressure reached this point, it would push the plug open, allowing steam to escape. As the pressure dropped, the spring would push the plug closed again. The problem with these spring-loaded valves was the spring itself. Like the bourdon tube in the gauge, the spring was a mechanical component subject to the stresses of its environment. The constant cycles of heating and cooling, the exposure to moisture, and the simple passage of time could cause the spring to lose its temper or its intended stiffness. A spring could weaken, causing the valve to open at a lower pressure than intended, making it difficult to maintain the necessary processing pressure. More dangerously, the spring could corrode and become stuck, or the valve seat could become fouled with mineral deposits from hard water or tiny particles of food, effectively sealing the valve shut. In such a case, the safety valve was no longer a safety device at all. Another form of pressure release was the petcock. This was not an automatic valve, but a small, manually operated valve, often resembling a tiny faucet handle. It served a dual purpose. It was used to vent air from the canner at the beginning of the process, a crucial step to ensure the interior was filled with pure steam. It could also, in theory, be opened by the user to manually release pressure if they saw the gauge climbing into a dangerous range. This, of course, relied entirely on the user's constant, vigilant attention and a trustworthy gauge. It was not a true safety valve, as it required human intervention to function in an emergency. The combination of these two components, a potentially inaccurate gauge and a potentially unreliable safety valve, created a scenario where home canning, particularly for the novice, was a process filled with uncertainty. The literature of the time, from government pamphlets to manufacturers' manuals, was filled with stern warnings. users were instructed to never leave the canner unattended, to watch the gauge constantly, and to be wary of any unusual behavior. Despite these warnings, accidents were not uncommon. They ranged from minor incidents of overpressure plugs releasing with a startling bang and a jet of steam, to catastrophic failures where the canner itself would rupture, or the lid would fly off with explosive force, causing severe burns and significant property damage. The 1930s brought new urgency to the field of home food preservation. The Great Depression made the practice not just a matter of thrift, but often one of survival. Families relied on their gardens and the ability to preserve their harvest to see them through the winter. The use of pressure canners increased dramatically, and with this increased use came a greater awareness of the equipment's shortcomings. During this decade, the United States Department of Agriculture, particularly through its Bureau of Home Economics, began to take a more active role in researching and providing guidance on home canning. Their publications became more detailed, their processing times more scientifically grounded. They recognized the inherent dangers of the equipment available to the public and began to address the problem of gauge accuracy head-on. This led to the rise of the Gauge Testing Clinic. Recognizing that individual homemakers had no way to verify their gauges, the USDA, in cooperation with state agricultural colleges and their county extension services, began to organize community events where people could bring in their canner lids to have the gauges tested. An extension agent, often a home economist, would be equipped with a master gauge. This was a high-quality, laboratory-grade gauge that was itself regularly calibrated against a dead weight tester, an instrument that uses precise, known weights to create a known, accurate pressure. The agent would have a testing unit, a small vessel that could be pressurized with a hand pump, equipped with fittings to attach both the master gauge and the consumer's gauge side by side. The process was methodical and calm. The homemaker would present her canner lid. The agent would carefully attach the lid's gauge to the testing apparatus. The master gauge would be attached to another port. The agent would then slowly pump air into the system, and all eyes would watch the two needles. The agent would observe the consumer's gauge as the master gauge passed key pressure points, 5 psi, 10 psi, 15 psi. At each point, they would note the reading on the consumer's dial. The results would then be recorded on a small tag affixed to the gauge. The tag might reads 1 pound high at 10 psi, or OK at 10, but reads 2 pounds low at 15. For a gauge that was off, the advice was not to attempt a repair. These gauges were not designed to be easily recalibrated in the field. Instead, the user was advised on how to compensate. When your recipe calls for 10 pounds of pressure, the agent would explain, you must let the needle on your dial climb to 11. This required the user to remember and apply this correction every single time they used the canner. For gauges that were wildly inaccurate, stuck, or clearly damaged, the only recommendation was replacement. These clinics were a crucial, if cumbersome, solution to a widespread problem. They represented the first organized, systemic effort to bring a measure of standardization and safety to the process. In parallel, manufacturers began to slowly improve the safety features of their canners. The simple spring-loaded valve was sometimes supplemented or replaced by other mechanisms. One such innovation was the fusible plug. This was a small, threaded plug fitted into an opening in the canner lid. The center of the plug was filled with a soft metal alloy with a specific, low melting point. The alloy was designed to remain solid at the normal operating temperatures of the canner, but if the temperature and pressure rose to a dangerous level, the alloy would melt, the plug would be pushed out, and the steam would be safely vented. The fusible plug had the advantage of having no moving parts to stick or corrode. It was a simple, passive safety device. However, it had its own drawbacks. It was a one-time use device. If it blew, the canning process was ruined, and the user had to purchase and install a new plug before the canner could be used again. It also did not provide a gradual release of pressure. Its release was sudden and often startling, venting a large volume of steam and often a good deal of the canner's contents along with it. The 1940s marked a pivotal moment in the history of home canning. The entry of the United States into World War II created an unprecedented demand for home food preservation. With commercial canned goods being diverted to the war effort and rationing in effect, the government launched the Victory Garden campaign. Citizens were encouraged to plant gardens and preserve as much of their own food as possible, with slogans like, "Can all you can, it's a real war job." Home canning became a patriotic duty. This national mobilization placed immense pressure on the industry and the institutions that supported it. Suddenly, millions of people, many of them inexperienced, were using pressure canners. The need for safe, reliable equipment and clear, unambiguous instructions was more critical than ever. The federal government, through the War Production Board, deemed the manufacturing of pressure canners essential to the war effort, even as materials like aluminum and steel were being strictly rationed. The USDA, in collaboration with the National Pressure Cooker Company, which would later become Presto, and other manufacturers, ramped up its research and educational outreach. The gauge testing clinics run by county extension agents became more widespread and standardized. It was understood that ensuring the accuracy of the nation's pressure canner gauges was a matter of national food security. It was during this period of intense focus that one of the most significant innovations in pressure canner design emerged, the weighted gauge. This device represented a fundamental shift away from the delicate, fallible, board-on-tube dial gauge as the primary means of pressure regulation. The weighted gauge was, by contrast, a model of simplicity and reliability, governed by basic physics rather than sensitive mechanical linkages. The weighted gauge consisted of a small vent pipe, or steam port, that projected upwards from the canner lid. A precisely calibrated weight, often shaped like a small disc or cylinder with a hole in the middle, was placed over this vent pipe. The weight would sit on the pipe, blocking the escape of steam. As pressure built inside the canner, it would exert an upward force on the underside of the weight. When the pressure reached a point where the upward force was just greater than the downward force of the weight, it would lift the weight slightly, allowing a puff of steam to escape. This release of steam would cause the pressure to drop slightly. The weight would resettle, and the process would repeat. The result was a device that not only indicated when the target pressure had been reached, but actively regulated it. The rhythmic jiggling or rocking of the weight, accompanied by a gentle hiss of escaping steam, provided both an audible and visible signal that the canner was operating at the correct pressure. The user no longer had to stare intently at a needle on a dial. They could now listen for the steady, reassuring cadence of the weighted gauge from across the kitchen. The accuracy of this system was not dependent on springs or gears, but on the mass of the weight and the area of the vent pipe opening, two variables that were fixed and not subject to drift or wear in the same way a dial gauge was. A 10-pound weight was a 10-pound weight, and its performance would not degrade over time. Many weighted gauges were designed with multiple pressure settings. A common design, famously used by the National Company, featured a single weight that was composed of 3 separate interlocking pieces. The central piece alone might provide 5 psi of pressure. Adding one of the outer rings would increase the total weight to achieve 10 psi. Adding the second ring would bring the total to 15 psi. This allowed for great flexibility with a single, simple component. The advent of the weighted gauge did not immediately render the dial gauge obsolete. For a time, many canners were produced with both. The dial gauge provided a useful visual indication of the pressure inside the canner as it was building up and cooling down, while the weighted gauge served as the primary, highly reliable regulator during the actual processing period. A user could watch the needle on the dial approach 10 psi and then know that the pressure was correct when the 10-pound weight began its steady jiggle. This dual-system approach provided a level of redundancy and user confidence that had been previously unattainable. The safety valves also continued to evolve. Alongside the primary regulator, whether it was a dial and petcock system or a weighted gauge, canners were increasingly equipped with secondary and sometimes tertiary safety devices. The fusible metal plug remained a common feature. In addition, some designs incorporated an overpressure plug made of rubber. This rubber plug was designed to be forced out of its port in an extreme overpressure situation. It was cleaner and easier to replace than a melted fusible plug. Another important safety innovation of this era was the development of more sophisticated lid-locking mechanisms. Early canners had lids that could, in theory, be opened while the unit was still under some pressure, a recipe for a steam explosion. Newer designs began to incorporate interlocks. These were small, passive safety devices that would prevent the lid from being rotated and opened as long as there was any pressure inside the canner. A common design involved a small pin that would be pushed up by the internal pressure, engaging a lock on the lid. Only when the pressure had returned to zero would the pin drop, allowing the lid to be safely opened. This simple mechanical feature removed a significant source of user error and potential injury. By the end of the 1940s, the pressure canner had been transformed. The intense crucible of the war effort had accelerated its technological development, forcing a collaboration between government science, industry, and home economists that resulted in a much safer, more reliable, and more user-friendly appliance. The 1950s ushered in an era of post-war prosperity and a focus on the modern, convenient home. The pressure canner, now a mature technology, solidified its place in the suburban kitchen. The heavy, industrial-looking steel models of the past gave way almost completely to lighter, more manageable canners made of stamped or cast aluminum. Underwriters Laboratories, or UL, an independent safety science company, began to play a more prominent role. UL certification became a powerful marketing tool for manufacturers. A canner bearing the UL mark had been subjected to a battery of rigorous safety tests. These tests would verify the structural integrity of the pot and lid under high pressure, test the accuracy and reliability of the pressure release mechanisms, and ensure that safety features like lid locks functioned correctly over many cycles of use. For the consumer, the UL listing was a seal of approval, an assurance that the product met a recognized standard for safety and performance. The user manuals and recipe books that accompanied these new canners were also vastly improved. They were no longer just collections of recipes with stern warnings. They were comprehensive educational documents. They explained in clear, simple terms the scientific principles behind pressure canning. They detailed why venting, or exhausting the canner for a period of time before sealing it, was crucial, to drive out all the air so the interior contained only pure steam, ensuring an accurate processing temperature. They provided detailed charts with processing times adjusted for altitude, recognizing that at higher elevations, a higher pressure is needed to achieve the same temperature. The gauge testing clinics offered by Extension Services continued, but their nature began to change. With the rise of the more reliable weighted gauge, the focus shifted slightly. While dial gauges still needed regular testing, agents now also spent time educating users on the proper function and care of the new weighted gauges. They would explain how to ensure the vent pipe was kept clean and free of debris. As a clog, there could be just as dangerous as a faulty spring valve. The design of the gauges themselves saw subtle refinements. Dials became clearer and easier to read, with markings not just for pressure but sometimes also for corresponding altitudes. The zero pin, a small post at the zero mark on the dial that prevented the needle from dropping below it, became a standard feature. This was important because if the needle rested against the pin when the canner was cold, the user knew it wasn't stuck somewhere below zero, which would cause it to read artificially low when under pressure. Safety relief systems became more integrated and redundant. A typical canner from the late 1950s or 1960s would have multiple layers of protection. The primary pressure regulator would be the weighted gauge, rocking steadily at 5, 10, or 15 psi. If for some reason the vent pipe for the weighted gauge became blocked and the pressure continued to rise, a secondary safety valve, often a small spring-loaded device or a rubber overpressure plug, was designed to release at a higher pressure, perhaps 20 or 25 psi. And beyond that, the lid itself often featured a safety vent in its locking mechanism, designed to unseal and vent steam in a controlled manner before the pressure could reach a point that would compromise the structural integrity of the unit. The modern pressure canner was designed with the assumption that failures could happen, and it provided multiple fail-safes to manage those failures in a safe and controlled way. By the 1960s and into 1970, the evolution of the pressure canner's core safety and calibration features had largely reached its conclusion. The designs and principles established in the post-war era had proven to be so effective that they have remained the standard to this day. The dial gauge, while still available on some models, is now almost universally accompanied by a weighted gauge or a similar deadweight regulator. The emphasis in testing and education is to treat the dial gauge as a reference and the weighted gauge as the true and accurate arbiter of pressure. The journey from the 1920s to the 1970s was a quiet one, taking place not in major laboratories or famous factories, but in the test kitchens of the USDA, the workshops of manufacturers like National Presto and Miro, and the community halls where county extension agents patiently tested gauge after gauge. It was an evolution driven by necessity, first by the economic hardship of the Depression, and then by the patriotic fervor of the war effort. It was a process of incremental improvement, of learning from failures and developing simple, robust solutions. The story of the pressure canner gauge and safety valve is not one of a single brilliant invention, but of a slow, collaborative effort to tame a powerful physical process and make it safe for domestic use. It is a story about the gradual accumulation of knowledge and the translation of that knowledge into reliable mechanical devices. The inaccurate Borden tube and the fallible spring valve of the early years gave way to the unyielding physics of the weighted gauge, the simple certainty of the fusible plug, and the layered redundancy of modern safety systems. Tonight, as we settle into stillness, we can reflect on this overlooked history. We can appreciate the peace of mind that comes from a well-understood and well-engineered tool. The gentle, rhythmic hiss of the weighted gauge is more than just a sound from the kitchen. It is the audible proof of a half-century of quiet, careful innovation. It is the sound of a hazard contained, a process perfected, and a harvest safely preserved. It is the sound of a problem meticulously and finally put to rest.